Okay, so hopefully you can hear me okay. I apologize. Our normal mic setup is not here. Hopefully it'll be back in the future. We had a technical swap. I'm Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. I'm going to talk about sort of setting aside most of our tools and trying to use just RxJS. I'm going to ask the audio people. Did you drop that slightly? It was really difficult. Okay. I was the first Angular bootcamp teacher, although I think it's actually been many, many months, possibly a year or more since I have done it. And I'm at Oasis Digital. There's my contact info. This is what you were sold when you signed up for free today, so hopefully it looks a little bit familiar. The agenda is we're going to look at a small Angular app briefly, and that app is going to use RxJS for some data flow. And then we're going to look at basically that same app rebuilt, but not using Angular, just using Rx for the data flow. And we're going to see there's a lot of similarities, and there are some important differences. And as you know, I really thought I pressed Do Not Disturb. Okay. There are important differences. And from those, we should be able to see some lessons. And I think the lessons will be around, like, what does Rx do for us, and what does Angular do for us? And I think it's actually a pretty important topic. There are too many projects that are trying to use Angular to do things you should just be kind of using Rx for, and vice versa. So if you want to follow along the code, the first link is to the example program we're going to look at on GitHub. The second link is that same thing on Stackblitz. If you go to the first one, you can find your way to the second one. And then the third one is the code where I recreated the same app without using that. So it's okay if you don't want to write these down. I can put these back up at the end if anybody wants to take a picture. I really need to find a way to signal that I will not be answering that phone. Okay, so now we should be getting to code. So let's set all this aside. I'll sit down here. Hopefully the camera is still okay. Okay, so this is a program that everyone that works here is familiar with, and I suspect a lot of people in the room have seen this program before. Here's the same program running a different way. So it's sort of very typical of a screen in a typical enterprise application, right? So some kind of list, some way of filtering that list. You can point size? Okay. Okay, so there's a list, there's a way of filtering it, and then when you click on somebody in the list, you see more details about them. So it's it's not quite master detail because there's not two levels of like rows to show, but it's like a list detail type screen. So I can click back and forth, or I can maybe type a couple of letters and I get a shorter list. And we actually use this example when we teach Angular Bootcamp to illustrate some ideas around like debouncing inputs and that sort of thing. And I'm just going to assume that everybody here could probably code a screen like this. Let's take a show of hands. Have you ever written a screen that vaguely resembles this in an app? Okay, so for the sake of those watching on a video, 2/3 of the room raised their hand to that. So, okay, so I have that same program here in Stackblitz, and I just made it available here because it's a little bit easier to look at the code together. I'm going to guess I need to go up one bigger. Okay, so I'm going to close that bit because we just saw it running. So just to get a quick idea how this thing works, there's an entire Angular CLI project here, which doesn't matter. This app is just the stuff in the app directory as with any Angular app. There is a module, but it doesn't really matter. We're not doing anything important there. We have an interface that defines a type, and then we have a overall component here that brings in an employee list. Our employee list sets up the overall screen. So this screen, there's a part on the left and a part on the right. And so we have a two across. This does some kind of we're probably using CSS grid, I would guess, to make these show up left and right. And then we have I guess a section on the left that has the employees with the name filter. The only real Angularism in here is right there. So we have a bit of Angular to tie a form control that we work with in code to something we put on the screen. And then we have another one for the sort. And that's a select control. It has the same syntax. And then we bring in another component to show the list, and bring in yet another component to show the detail. Okay, so that's like just a simple overall Angular application. I'm intentionally going to look at this code last, because this is what I'm going to convert to RxJS. To look at the list, I've implemented my own way of doing a table in like highlighting the selected one in yellow. Pretty typical thing you do if you're writing your own table. Now, I probably wouldn't do this in a real app. A real app probably is going to use some kind of off-the-shelf table. It might use an Angular material mat table. After 6 messages in a row, I will have to message back that I am in a talk right now and will not be answering unless literally the house is on fire. Okay, so I would use like an Angular material mat table. I might use an AG grid. If I'm working in a big company, there's probably already an officially blessed table, that sort of thing. But for simplicity, I've just implemented it here with Angular. Then the detail view is even simpler. I've just done data binding in my detail view to take this employee that's been handed to this view and show a few basic attributes. So all pretty basic use of Angular, except for one really interesting part. And that's what's in here in this main file. And this is where I made heavy use of RxJS. So the Angular way of making this data flow work is actually to use RxJS. And so I did that here. Oops, wrong tabbing. Lost my way there. Okay. I made a couple of form control objects which tie into the form controls I pointed out on the screen here and here. Those form controls, here we go. So name filter, for example, that exposes an RxJS observable via value changes. So I've hung on to that, and I've put the initial value in. And this is a little bit of a, this is an Angular API rough edge. I have in-person asked Angular team members to please make this better, and a couple agreed it should be better, but no one has actually made it better. And that is, I can get the value changes as an observable, but what I really want is I want the entire history of that thing as an observable. I don't only want the changes, I want the first one also, and all the changes. And so to do that in Angular, I have to take those changes, and I have to tack that initial value onto the beginning. So as a show of hands, who has ever done this exact move in an Angular app? So about a third of the people. It's pretty good. Okay, I do the same thing for the sort. So this is me, it's like basically this chunk right here. This is trying to bridge the gap between what Angular put on the screen and getting an Rx observable of that to continue working with. Okay, so then at this point in the code, I have it. I have an observable of the list of names, or an observable of the name filters the user has entered, and an observable of the sort choices they've made. I do an Rx combine latest. I do a debounce to avoid like requerying the server all the time if the user is typing quickly. I do a switch map to call the loader. Then I take the results. I sort them by the sort key. In this example, I'm actually doing the sort locally, which you can see happening right here. We have a similar example where we ask the server to do the sort. There's trade-offs between those. And then finally, the selected employee, so this is an observable, and this is the result of taking which ID was selected and loading the details to get the information that displays over here. So as I type here, that just sent 3 values down an observable pipeline. Then Rx things happened to call a back end. We actually used the Angular HTTP client to call the back end, but we did that via an RxJS switch map. We got a list. Then when I clicked on one, that sent a value down an observable pipeline of what was selected. That caused another of these RxJS switch map pipelines to happen to load the details and got displayed. So that is, like, an awful lot of that is Rx. An awful lot of what I said was RxJS. And there really, in this application, Angular didn't actually do that much, right? So if I look at this thing, there's this bit where I'm talking to an Angular API, and there's this bit that I'm using to work around an oddity of that API, and then everything from here on is Rx code. Over in the template, all of this is just, essentially everything from here to here is just HTML with just a couple little handles, right? And then the output here, I'm doing some Angular binding to like carry the data from this to another component. But really, in this application, Angular actually isn't doing that much. Now, Angular is great when you're doing a lot with it, but I was super curious, what if I didn't have Angular? Like, how similar of an application could I write if I only had the tools that we're building on, like TypeScript and especially RxJS, which seems like the most important tool in use here? What if I just had those things? What if I didn't have Angular? What would I have to do to like make this application work? And so that's what I did. This is that application without the Chrome at the top, re-implemented without Angular. It works about the same way. You get a list, you click, they highlight, and so on, right? So it's basically the same app. And now I'm going to take a little tour of how I wrote it and see what we can learn from that. Okay, so, oops. Trying to figure out, something became lost in my screen sizing. Okay. Okay, so what did I pick up? Like, what tools am I using? So let's take a look at the package.json. Well, the important tool I'm using is RxJS. I didn't want to redo my styling, so in our Angular Bootcamp class, for the moment, for today, we're using a CSS kit called Materialize CSS. It gives you a bunch of utility classes that make your application look somewhat like Angular material, but not exactly. And that sort function came from Lodash, so I held on to Lodash. I realized that in my example I just showed, I made my own table control. And that's a really weird thing to do. I mean, I think I had a conversation with some people I work with, and we talked about this. And it's actually somewhat rare in our real work to make our own table, to HTML template out our own table. It's much more common that we either grab something off the shelf like AGGrid if we want a lot of features, or maybe we grab something like Angular Materials mat table, or sometimes some other choices. But I said, well, if we don't do that for real, I don't need to do that in my example. So for my example, I grabbed AGGrid. So I'm going to use AGGrid to display this list, right? Because that's a more realistic thing. And that also reduces the extent to which I'd use Angular, right? So if AGGrid is rendering this entire box of the screen right here, then I wouldn't use Angular to render that box of the screen. And this part up here was pretty much static HTML. That only left this part of the screen to be rendered dynamically with some template insertion. And we'll see in a minute what I did to do that. Okay, so here's what I'm using. I'm using Rx for data flow, Materialize for style, Lodash because I'm grabbing a single sort function out of it, AGGrid to display like the bulk of the UI. So I've outsourced most of the API complexity to this free thing I picked up because I'm using the core version here. And then I grabbed a library called lit.html to use for templating. There's 1,000 ways to do templating, but this is just the one I grabbed. It's currently substantially ascendant in popularity. Okay, now I need to bundle this, and I'm not doing Angular, so I don't have Angular CLI. And I have to tell you, if you've gotten used to Angular CLI and you've forgotten what it's like out there, it's rough out there. But with some fumbling about, I landed as Parcel. So Parcel is a competitor to Webpack. I landed that as probably the easiest way to make a tiny little standalone program like this work. We use Parcel in our Angular, like to the extent we occasionally still teach AngularJS, we use Parcel to bundle it here. So I don't know if anybody knows that. Even the people here who might have taught AngularJS here recently might not have noticed that. But Parcel, I'm looking at you, Jack. Parcel is used. Okay, so let's look at the program, right? So, when I type start, it's just telling Parcel to bundle. When you run Parcel, you're saying bundle and serve for development, this file. So I'm basically pointing Parcel at my index.html. My index.html mentions a thing called index.ts. Parcel knows to go take that index.ts and go do something with it to run it. Parcel knows to TypeScript it. Incidentally, there's no Parcel config file here. So although not relevant to most Angular users, it's pretty slick that TypeScript is now so accepted that tools like Parcel, like they already know. Like there's not even a Parcel TypeScript plugin. There's not even a config file to go flip the TypeScript switch on. It just arrives already ready to do TypeScript. That's how much TypeScript has permeated outside of just Angular. It is very popular broadly. Okay, so index.ts. So this is my entire program here. Well, a couple of bits in other files. So This line of code, this is exactly the same as what I wrote in an Angular program. I just said, go grab the order by function out of Lodash. And then I'm going to need some RxJS stuff. These 2 lines of code, this is the same as I wrote in the Angular program. I have an employee loader. This is the same line of code I wrote to go import that employee loader. But let's look and see what I did differently in the employee loader. So for reference, the employee loader that I implemented with Angular looks like this. So it has some Angularisms at the top. It uses Angular's HTTP wrapper. It uses Angular to make an injectable service. It uses RxJS. It imports the type. And then inside of, so like there's this Angularism, but inside of the Angularism, it's really just a function. And it ends up calling some Angular thing to do the HTTP call. So there's little bits of Angular, but I kind of the core of what this is doing, which is formatting these HTTP requests properly, that's just code I wrote here. And so if we go look here, it's basically the same. So that get list call, it just forms up some HTTP parameters and uses the Angular way of calling HTTP. Well, there's a thing built in called fetch. And fetch is actually pretty good at fetching over HTTP. And so I think, let's count lines, but yeah, there's like 6 lines of real code here. And I think there's 7 because the way I formatted it, I get 1 line with that. And so I would say for this particular function, it basically cost me nothing to not have Angular, which is a really interesting insight. Like Angular has a lot of features around like UIs and components and routing and so on. But the feature around fetching from HTTP, I think that's kind of mainly in Angular for historical reasons, because they needed to provide this solid foundation that would work across all the browsers reliably and so on. But if I don't really care about for this app, and it turns out that that saying from fetch is good enough. Well, from fetch, that's an RxJS thing. So RxJS already has the ability to go use the underlying browser fetch library to make an HTTP call. And so it actually works completely fine to just use RxJS and fetch to make my HTTP call. Paul, for some reason, had mentioned interviewing. Someone did this live in an interview. They used fetch to load data. And like, it was kind of like eye-opening. Like, wow. I guess it's legit to do that. And I'm curious if there'll be discussion afterward about, is it okay to do that in an Angular program? I'm really curious if any consensus emerges in the inevitable argument about whether line 21 is a legit thing to do in an Angular program. But in any event, this is a non-Angular program, so I don't have Angular HTTP. I do have RxJS. It already knows how to do a fetch. Its API is slightly different. You make a new URL object, and then you do this search params append thing instead of making an HTTP params and calling set. So the API looks different, but you can easily imagine translating one to the other without any difficulty. And then details is even simpler because it's just appending a string and then fetching that URL. And in the Angular version, we just appended a string and then fetched that URL. So the code is basically the same. OK, so we've already seen now that like the talking to the server part of the program is semantically almost identical in my non-Angular version of this. So let's take a look at what actually comes together. Here's when it starts to get different in exciting ways. In Angular, I have this amazing capability to do component-level styled scoping and all that. But I'm just hanging out here, apart from all of that. I got nothing. All I've got is the fact that if I tell Parcel to import some CSS, it'll get it onto the page. And so this is the point in this conversion where I said, wow, I miss Angular here, right? So the ability to just have this pervasive component scoped CSS everywhere is really fantastic. And if you step over to a tool set that doesn't have it, you'll miss it. OK, so I have an employee grid and employee detail. Those are roughly correspond to this detail view and this list table view. So let's take a look at it. I'll wait till I call those, then we'll explain how those work. OK, so here in the Angular program, the heart of the program was use the Angular API here through here to get a hold of an observable of what the user is inputting. and then do some RxJS pipelining to actually make the data flow through the app. So it's pretty similar here. So I don't have Angular, so I had to go talk to the DOM API directly. If you look, it's a little bit gross here, but I want to talk to that grid thing, so I had to like query the DOM to get a reference to it. Like that name filter, I want to talk to that, so I had to query the DOM to get a reference to that. So it's a little bit gross. My index HTML, here we go. Like I have this name filter. I had to use this ID to grab it. Right? So I don't have Angular, so I couldn't go in here and do something. So I just wrote code that reached into the DOM and grabbed it. This was also a definite downgrade, right? Like the coupling is there, but it's not obvious. If I was over here editing the HTML, I have no way of knowing, looking at the HTML, which part of this HTML I'm like attaching functionality to. It's sort of like the jQuery old days. So I'm sort of back in the jQuery area here, even though I'm not using jQuery. So instead of this nice Angularism where right in the template we can mark that connection point, I just had to write code to imperatively go reach into that and set up the connection. But in any event, so I end up with the name filter element. Now, this is when it started getting nice again. So there's, like, with Angular, it's a kind of a big deal. You have to reach to this reactive form thing to get the idea of an observable of the changes of a form control. Well, it turns out if you just do an RxJS level from event, right? So that's an RxJS thing. RxJS actually makes it pretty easy to capture the input event coming from an input element, and that input event is what happens whenever anybody types anything in. So it turned out to be approximately the same amount of code with and without Angular to get an observable stream of the user's input. And I was surprised by that, right? So I thought, oh, Angular's probably doing a lot for me on like that binding part. It actually wasn't. It wasn't doing a lot on the binding part. It was doing a lot on the component part, but for making the binding, like, yeah, once I have the reference, I can get an observable string. So I have basically the same code here. A couple little API-isms. So this is the Rx event, and then I had to do this map to go dig the actual value out of that DOM event. So this line here, line 26, Angular would do for me. So I had to do this extra work. But then Angular doesn't give me an initial value, and neither does this. So I had to do basically the exact same start with coding with just RxJS as I had to do with Angular to say, oh, I want that initial value in my stream. I'll skip over this because it's essentially the same. And then from here on, there's basically no change in this whole section here. A couple minor syntax things because of how I imported things, but it's the same thing. I wrote the same code. So the heart of the data flow in this Angular application here and this non-Angular application is actually implemented in the same Rx code. All right, so the lesson that I take from this is RxJS is ridiculously powerful, and it's a tool you can and probably should carry with you both in and out of Angular projects. Here at Oasis Digital, we actually use it on Node projects quite a bit. That seems to be somewhat rare. When you go to the Rx issue tracker and you look for issues discussing Node use, there's not a huge number of them. But it works great. I mean, it's fully supported, works great. OK, then lastly, I need to glue the output of this RxJS pipeline back to my screen, right? So in Angular, to glue the output back, I simply took that observable stream and put it on a variable. And then at the point I wanted to consume it, I used my favorite, the async pipe, right? Well, I don't have an async pipe over in this non-Angular example program. So I had to subscribe. And I've written defective code here because I've leaked the description. I haven't like cleaned up or anything because it's just a small standalone example. But I really missed Angular when I got to this point. I said there's doing this kind of conversion, you start to see what Angular really does and doesn't do. That async pipe, where it takes responsibility for unsubscribing, that is just a gem of Angular. I'll do another show of hands. Raise your hands if you're using the async pipe a lot in your programs. Raise your hand if you're not using the async pipe much in your programs. You didn't raise either one. No? So you're a no. So we have several people who won't raise their hand but are not using it. This tells me we probably should have yet another talk here about successful adoption of the async pipe. It is just glorious. Okay, so lacking the async pipe in this non-Angular program, I had to do this. I had to subscribe by hand. And I'm going to kind of elide a lot of the detail here about what I did with it, with this grid thing, because I had to write some code to interface to AGGrid, and that's kind of out of scope here. But then lastly, when I click on one, right, so I click on one here, and I get some data loaded on the right, how does that work? Well, in the Angular version, the way that worked was, let me see here. In the Angular version, there was a select event which I was emitting from my table control. That guy there. And when that select ID came out, I pushed it into an RxJS subject, and then I used that RxJS subject to do an RxJS data flow to make it switch map load the data. And as you see here, I just captured the observable, and then I used the async pipe to shove the results onto the screen. So I really leveraged the Angular stuff really well there. And each of those things I just said, they each cost me extra complexity when I set Angular down to rewrite the program. So, okay, so we've got this selected ID. So I had to write my own wrapper around this one specific use of AGGrid. And let me tell you, the AGGrid API is surprising. It has some like the JavaScript level AGGrid API, it surprised me. I managed to get past it and make it emit make it publish an observable, a subject of the selected row. So it wasn't too bad. Like I had to write a couple lines of code to interface to AGGrid, but I managed to get a selected subject, and that let me go back out at my application level and basically do the same thing. So I got to get the right place here. So right here. So I have a observable coming out of the selection. I switch map it to my loader to get the details, and then it gets displayed on the screen by Angular. Well, here I have an observable but selected. I switch map it to load my data, and then I again manually subscribed, and I had to write this show employee thing to display it. So this will be the last bit of code I actually go over. So Angular has this great like templating thing, right? I could do all this. Well, when I set Angular down, I didn't have that. And I briefly contemplated putting the data on the screen by writing code like this, by actually reaching into the DOM. But that was unthinkable. Like it was completely unacceptable to do that. I couldn't even bear to do it once for a tiny example. So instead, I picked up a tool called lit.html, which is maybe a topic for another talk on another day. But it is it does template rendering. And so I was able to write essentially analogous code. So this code here is not exactly the same syntax. It's made by a different branch of Google. So 3 buildings over, there's a team that wrote this syntax from the team that wrote this syntax. It's not clear to me that one is better or worse. They both seem to work fine. But with Angular, it was in the box. I didn't have to reach for it. I didn't have to pick a version. I didn't have to worry if it's compatible. It just worked. When I set down Angular, I had to go look and select and pick up and import and use a templating solution to get my employee details. The plus side is the choosing was a little bit of a hard part. The researching, I had to think about this. But actually using it was essentially trivial. What I had to do in here and what I had to do in here was about the same. And then to make the connection from this template, put it on the screen, it was actually just one line. So it was not impractical to do. It was just irritating that it wasn't in the box. So I again missed Angular because I didn't have it in the box. Okay, so that, leaving out the AGGrid adapter, because it's pretty far away from what I'm trying to get at here, that's a complete walkthrough. So we saw an Angular program. We saw a non-Angular program that does the same thing. And we talked about a bunch of little lines that were, actually some lines that were similar to the point of being identical, some things that were different, and some things I had to go cobble together separately. So that's the end of my walkthrough, leaving lots of time for Q&A. So we have I guess a volunteer to walk a microphone around.
Well, I'll start with a question. When you had the get list and you use fetch, for what we showed, it seemed to be about the same. But I think what we're losing compared to Angular with that is testability, because the dependency injection gives a way to have tests, and it specifically gives HTTP client testing module. I don't know if there's a way to do equivalent level of testing if we were using fetch directly. Do you have any ideas on that?
Feel free to, like, slime me on Twitter or something. But it's a perception in the Angular world that this framework level DI is like critical for testing. But there are other communities that seem to be approximately as motivated to do testing as Angular that don't have that. And what they do instead is they hook the module loader at the language level to say, when I'm in test mode, instead of making fetch come in, make this mock fetch come in. And so this code is absolutely 100% as testable. It's just you have to reach for a different testing tool to do it. Instead of reaching for the Angular test bed mechanism that does a Angular framework level DI substitution, you reach for the module loader level substitution of the external operation. There are complex trade-offs both ways. The way Angular does it is actually kind of reminiscent of what we do with, like, in Java with Spring. But there are vast swaths of JavaScript developers that are doing testing that don't have framework level DI, and they seem to be okay. It may be that they don't know what they're missing, but they seem to be quite successful anyway. Paul's got to have a hard question for me.
So I guess building off of the using fetch over HTTP client, the thing that I thought of was with HTTP client, you have the ability to set up interceptors at the application level. And so if you use fetch at any point, you're going to be dodging those interceptors. So does fetch have a way to add things like that that you could potentially use instead?
I am not a fetch expert. You could certainly write your own function that you call, that you intercept, but I'm not enough of a fetch expert. That's a trade-off, right? If you adopt a framework that has an interceptor notion built in, then when you want to do interceptors, it's just right at hand. And if you have a vast team of people, they're all going to do interceptors in the same way. That's a big payoff of Angular, right? It's a platform. You get this consistent, known way to solve that problem. If you step off of that and you build off the low-level tools, you are more likely to have, among a family of projects, a diaspora of different ways. Each person will have reinvented a way to hook their fetch. So yeah, that is absolutely a selling point of Angular.
How do the build sizes compare? And are there any of the techniques from the non-Angular approach that you could cherry pick to have a beneficial effect on your build size?
I tried to get a build size visualization tool working, but there were just too many obstacles to fit it in scope for this talk. But I can tell you the story of what happened anyway. For the HTTP part, my non-Angular example is a clear winner because fetch is built in. And so literally the bytes you see here where I called fetch, like this gets compiled to JavaScript, and there is no other library code. It's just this code minified. That's it. So big win on fetch. Lit HTML is very small and very fast. It has a different set of trade-offs from Ivy, but it's like in that category of goodness. It's very small and it's very fast. So I would say for the templating part, this is probably about par with Angular. Where it gets ugly is the Angular CLI team has done so much hard work for so long to just fight their way through the mess that is the ecosystem that I couldn't figure out what series of switches to flip, at least in the short time I spent doing so, to avoid this line bringing in all of Lodash. You would think that there would be some trivial import syntax to take the ES module formatted Lodash and just get the tiny segment you want. And I fiddled with it 6 different ways before I gave up. I mean, I'm sure I would have figured out eventually, right? But there were people talking about, oh, you need to like add Babel into your project. Then there's a custom Babel plugin that knows how to streamline your Lodash. And that just seemed so wrong. I really, really don't want to do that. And so at the Lodash part, I think if I import Lodash correctly in an Angular app, I believe Angular CLI already has all the right bits to chop out the 98% of it I'm not using. I've left an elephant in the room, though, and that's this thing, not that one, this one. I brought in AG Grid to do this. Even the small build of AG Grid is vastly larger than everything else combined, no matter which tool you're using. So if you're going to use a third-party grid, as most like enterprise-y apps will use, that adding that grid probably costs you more bytes, to which all the others are just swamped in the difference. You know, like we're seeing people tweeting online the joy that, you know, their application went from a 5 megabyte bundle to a 4 megabyte bundle with Ivy. And that's great. If your application is this big, so Ivy saves you this much, but if your enterprise application is 1 megabyte, probably 600K of that is just one third-party library. So at the scale I'm working here, using a third-party library for my table control swamps all the other decisions. But all the other decisions come up pretty decent. More questions?
So obviously, you just discussed like a bunch of different trade-offs and you know, the pros and cons of picking each little piece out on your own versus just using Angular.
Yep.
And like at the end of the day, like picking them out all on your own didn't really buy you anything. It kind of hurt in some areas. But at the end of the day, the commonality between both of them is like what actually makes this thing work, obviously, is the RxJS. I think that's kind of the point of your talk.
Yes.
And the reason why I thought we were going to be talking about things like hiring is that, you know, we've obviously been doing a lot of it. And at the end of the day, like, how vital is it that we actually know RxJS? Like, because it looks like from what I'm hearing.
Put up my now hiring slide. Yes.
From what I'm hearing, it sounds like Angular almost doesn't matter so much as the RxJS. Is
Angular matters greatly, but for adding the nth person to an already working team, being good at RxJS is probably a lot more important. In fact, one of the folks here has said something along the lines of, just find people that know RxJS. We can teach them the Angular they need to know in their first month on the project. And I would even argue that Rx might be, in fact, I might, like getting good at RxJS is probably a longer, harder path than getting good at the rest of Angular. There's a reason why Rx is the one major external dependency of Angular. It's because like it's this huge, important piece. Does that answer your? Anybody else? Okay, we are all out, so we will wrap up with a few minutes to spare for chattering. Thank you all for coming. Hope you found something useful.